Okay, thanks for coming to the Forgotten Characters of History panel. I'm Erica Fredrickson. I'll be moderating, but hopefully all of these guys will also talk amongst themselves. I would like to hear them talk more than me. So, we also are going to have a reading right before we start our discussion. Dave Scott? Yeah, Dave Scott is going to come up and read first, and then I can introduce you to the panel and kind of dig in after that. Will you introduce yourself?
Check, check, check. Okay, my name's Dave Scott. When I got notified I was going to do a short story by Samuel, he said, I don't quite know where to put your story. It's Forgotten Characters of History. I'd say he got it just about right. As I get older, I feel more like that. A little background, I worked for the Forest Service for 27 years, and then I worked at Missoula Parks for 12 years. Then I retired, and one day my son says, Dad, tell me a story, a big moment in your life. And we were in the yard, and I told him this story, and he said, Dad, you need to write that down, or it dies when you do. So the next day, I wrote it on the computer, and I thought, man, this is really fun. Why am I quitting here? So I got launched off on writing and doing short stories, and one morning I woke up, and you have one of those dreams that you just can't forget. And I had one of those, and I thought, well, maybe I should start writing dreams. And I had met James Lee Burke at the Physical Fitness Center, and I think, well, maybe I'm nuts. Maybe I don't want to write dreams. Anyway, I saw Jim. I said, Jim, do you ever write down your dreams? He said, I got a stack full of them at home. So I figured, well, if he can do it, I can do it. So anyway, this dream is called the leg dream. Last night I had a very odd dream. I was playing guitar in my studio using my right foot and leg to tap out the beat as I played. I was really getting into the beat, playing some songs and tones that were particularly pleasing to my ear. The floor was pounding from the tap of my foot and leg. I could feel the vibration, and I was feeling real good. When I got done, I looked down at the front of my right leg between the ankle and the knee. There were big red spots on my skin that looked very puzzling and bizarre. I then looked at the back of my leg, and the calf muscle was totally gone. The back of my leg was a hollow basin with only the half bloody and gory bone showing. Funny thing, it didn't really hurt other than a dull sensation where the muscle had been. So I told my wife, Glenn, that we need to get to the emergency room. She drove me to St. Pat's, and then dropped me off, not what I was expecting. Figured she might want to stick around in case I die. She said she had to go shopping. Oh, well, we've both been pretty independent during our marriage, so I was okay with it. As she drove off, she rolled down the window and said, bummer about your leg. I went into the emergency room, and the doctor's name was Price, the same name of the doctor that did my knee surgery last October in real life at Missoula Bone and Joint. The doc looked at it and asked if I had to wear some kind of safety device around that leg for where I work. I work in a steel company. I said, yes, sometimes I have to wear a leg protector made of heavy cloth. He said, well, you won't be able to wear that device now. There's not enough leg left to secure the device. I told him maybe they won't make me wear the device so I don't lose my job. I asked the doc if my leg would heal. He told me no, just keep the dirt out of the leg and it'd be okay. When I woke, a flush of total relief went through my whole body. I was really glad it was a dream. But I did check my leg anyway to be sure all the leg was still there.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave. So I want to introduce our panel here. I just realized that I don't think Sam gave me the actual bios that I need. I do know the three. I know Nate very well, Nate Schweber here, former Missoulian, longtime Missoulian, and has come back to read a few times. And Bill Vaughn, who I took a class from many years ago, which probably doesn't remember. And Michael Ober, I don't know you, but I know of you, and so I'm happy to be able to introduce all of you today, and I'll have you guys maybe give a short bio yourselves if you would like. I just want to introduce your books really quickly, and then jump into the forgotten characters aspect of this. So we've got Bill's The Last Heir, which is the triumphs and tragedies of two Montana families. And it's a history of two families, the Herons and the Burks. Have very little in common, but they have personified two common threads in the history of the West, and we'll get to hear about that, I'm sure. And then The Last Heir recounts 12 decades of Burke and Heron triumphs and tragedies, the story of Montanans' Missouri River heartland, a history seen through the eyes and daily lives of those who lived it. And then Nate Schweber's This America of Ours uncovers the forgotten story of the Devotos, Bernard Devoto and Avis Devoto, who were these authors, or Avis was the kind of firebrand, the editor and wife, and they together were, a firebrand of American liberty and free speech, and really promoted public lands during their time. But they have definitely been forgotten in many ways, and so we'll discuss kind of what they. How they were seen at the time, and how that's changed, and what impact they had on wilderness. Michael Ober's book is exploration of Montana historic places on the National Register. And I was reading your intro today, and I live in the university apartments near Rock and Rudy's, so it was very cool to read that. So it's kind of a dive into some places that are well known, and then others that have been forgotten, but during their time were very important. So I just want to. You three should feel free to talk about whatever, but I want to just start with the obvious question, which is how you came to your story, because some of them are forgotten stories and people, and how did you discover them, and what about them made you want to write about it?
Well, I was attracted to this woman in college, and she was in college, and I was kind of attracted to her because I'd heard she was from a big ranch, so she probably had money. And she always had cigarettes, so I was sure she had money. And she was going out with one of my favorite professors when I went to school here. He taught film. It turned out that she was from a big ranch family, but they were completely incompetent and had squandered every dime they ever made. And I started thinking, maybe it would be to my advantage to use some of this against her later by researching something about this incompetent family. And in the beginning, they were not incompetent. Holly Heron was her great-grandfather, and he built a ranch that was 35,000 acres that surrounded Holter Lake. This was the Heron Ranch that later became, you guys probably have heard of this, it was later named the Oxbow Ranch. And he made a fortune first in cattle, in part by driving his sheep raising neighbors off the land in a process called whitecapping, and threatened to hang everyone he came up against. He also built walls around himself. Some of these you could see he built at least 20 miles of barbed wire fences around the Oxbow, which didn't even come close to encompassing it. But Holly Heron is famous in the sense he is a forgotten person, in the sense that if you look at case law in Montana, you will see that this guy loved to sue everyone because there are at least 3 huge Supreme Court cases that bear his name. Heron v., Heron v., Heron v. It doesn't matter. He sued everybody. So anyway, so I started thinking about this history and discovering what a bunch of jerks Kitty's ancestors on her Heron side were. They were arrogant, uneducated, and angry to a man. And on her Democratic side, the Burkes, they were professionals. They were One was a U.S. senator. Her grandfather was a civil engineer. Her great uncle was a Montana newspaper publisher and editor. And their peculiar sister joined a convent, the Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, in Wisconsin, and later discovered that Jesus was not going to do it for her, so she enrolled in Fanny Farmer School of Cookery in Boston. Anyway, so their side of the family is reasonably true as far as the documents reveal. The Burkes are what they said they were, except her grandfather lied about getting a degree in civil engineering. He never went to college. Other than that, they were pretty good. The rest of them, as I might talk about later, were complete jerks. That's how this book started.
Wow.
Book about jerks.
I wish I could say that the idea came to me from a woman I had a crush on. But I grew up in Missoula. And the very first thing I ever published was in my high school newspaper, and Erica was the editor. So she's the first person to edit anything that I ever wrote for publication. So it's cool to come full circle here. And I now live in New York City, and I work as a freelance journalist. And as a lot of freelance journalists of my caliber lament, I pitch a lot of ideas and I get a lot of ideas rejected. And I was really homesick and I wanted to write about the West because I missed it a lot. And I thought maybe if I could write stories about the West, I could get back here a little bit more often. And I pitched ideas about conservation. Oops, I pitched ideas about conservation. No, sorry about that. And it might not be a microphone thing. I can just talk if everybody can hear me. So I pitched ideas about conservation and I got rejected, and I just started to read more about conservation in the hopes of being able to write story pitches that would have a better chance of getting accepted. And eventually that led me to Bernard DeVoto. And there's a DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. I don't know if it's on the National Register of Historic Places, but it's on the top of the Bitterroot Mountains on Highway 12 between Montana and Idaho, just on the Idaho side of the divide. Despite growing up 90 minutes from that, I had no idea who they were. But once I started to read Bernard DeVoto, I just fell in love with his writing. And then I learned a lot about conservation from his writing. And then I learned about some of the things that he had done for conservation to protect public lands, and then that was in the 40s. He stopped. There were some plans to sell off millions of acres of public lands in the West. And writing in Harper's Magazine, he really led a crusade to stop that from happening. And then in the 1950s, there were plans to build dams inside national parks all over the West, and that was seen as a way, if the national parks could be industrialized, that would be a way of opening up all other public lands to exploitation and liquidation, and the DeVotos fought against that. So it was not only learning Bernard DeVoto because I wanted to know conservation, but I got to know his wife, Avis DeVoto, without whom there would have been no Bernard DeVoto. They were an awesome partnership. They were an awesome team. Bernard was a writer. She was an editor. They worked together awesomely. And then the real kicker with that, hopefully no spoilers, was that Avis, in the course of their fight, she became best friends with an aspiring cookbook chef living in Paris, Julia Child, and they wrote just voluminous letters back and forth together. So when I was researching my book, I got to read all the letters between Avis and Julia and all of Bernard's letters, which are at in an archive at Stanford. So I just had an enormous wealth of primary sources to work with. So that's the long story that hopefully you all could hear about how I came to my subject.
Oh, I don't know why they stopped.
Hang on.
Try that one. I think it's
It doesn't matter.
Hello?
Hello, is anybody there? Hello? It's all right. A quick introduction. My name is Michael Ober. I recently retired as an educator at Flathead Valley Community College as a director of the library. I've taught Montana history for 22 years. Always been a history guy. Always had an interest in it. And so the backstory in this book about historic sites leads to
speak a little louder.
leads to the origins of this book, when my wife and I retired, she was a registered nurse, we decided we were going to go to all 55 state parks in Montana. Boom! They're out there. And I don't know many people who've been to all 55. Have you ever been to Brush Lake State Park? You can throw a rock and hit North Dakota. I mean, it's just one of those pothole lakes in Sheridan County in northeast Montana, and it's beautiful, but nobody goes there. But we went there, and so there's a really cool book put out about 10 years ago on state parks.
Kristen Inbody and Aaron Madison.
Journalists,
Yeah.
Great Falls. They did the road trips, and they hit all these parks and wrote a book about it. So that's a guidebook. And in the back of the guidebook is a little kind of a checklist for road warriors and road trip people. So pretty soon, and we've been to a lot of those parks before, and pretty soon we realized that, you know, we could probably go to all of them, because when you retire, don't you want to fall in love with your state again and just go out and just see what it has to offer? Well, as it happens, we kept running into these places that were on the National Register of Historic Sites, NRHP, headquartered out of Washington. And you've all seen the aluminum plaques, haven't you? Picture those. You go to some place and it's either on a pedestal or it's on a wall. And kept running into these. And thought, well, that's interesting. I never thought this was here, and didn't really realize these places were on a national register. The extended story is, we used to come down and watch Grizzly football games. We met with some friends of ours every time we came down. Steve Woodruff, retired editor of the Julian. So we were at the Mustard Seed one night, and in a discussion that was probably fueled by too many margaritas, he said, why don't you do a book on historic sites? And he put me in Rimal at Mountain Press, and one thing led to another. Long story, we got a contract, did a contract for 3 years, and assembled a book. It might surprise people that there are more than 1,000 sites in Montana that are National Register, and I'll describe one to me and to my wife. It took a little digging to find it, but there's some highbrow and some lowbrow, some real eye candy places on a National Register, and there's some low-hanging fruit too. But that's the beauty of this whole thing, and as we got into this, we realized that there's just some, I was struck with the deep, deep variety of places in Montana that made it into the National Register. So we'll talk about those.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit along the lines of the forgotten characters and places at their time, and you've all kind of hinted at this in introducing how you came to your stories. At the time, they weren't. I mean, I'm hoping without giving away too many juicy details, because we want people to read. But maybe a little bit of just kind of like what the sort of, I guess, controversy around the Devotos, how they were seen at the time, the two families also, Bill, how they were seen at the time and were shaping politics a little bit, and then I guess, Michael, looking for you for maybe an interesting forgotten place that was, during its time was, shaping economy, or was like a hub for the people at the time.
Thanks. It's a great question. There's kind of been an ironic inversion with both of the Devotos between then and now. When they were alive, Bernard DeVoto was as famous as any writer in America. He won the Pulitzer Prize. He won the National Book Award. He had a monthly column in Harper's Magazine, and he also published in the big magazines, the Saturday Evening Post and Reader's Digest. He was an incredibly prolific writer. He was very controversial because he had very strong opinions. He stated them very forcefully, and he won these big awards for these magisterial nonfiction histories he wrote about the U.S. West. So he was as well known as anybody. And he was also infamous in his day because he got attacked a lot by Senator Joe McCarthy. So he was as well known as any writer in America in his day. And his wife, Avis, she really loved her privacy. She did not want the limelight. And that was a way that they were very complementary together. That was a way that they worked together. And over the years, Devoto, he became forgotten for a number of reasons, because he did have such spicy opinions. Even for the 40s and 50s, he was a man of his time. A lot of his opinions have not aged very well. Some of his opinions have aged incredibly, but a lot of them have not aged very well. And he was so independent and such a free thinker that, I don't want to postulate too much, but as the country gets more sort of politically polarized, he was seen as probably too, in some ways he was too right-wing for people who considered themselves left-wing to fully embrace, and he was probably too left-wing for people who considered themselves right-wing to fully embrace. He was completely independent, so he's kind of left without a home. And also, there was a guy that he was a mentor to, the novelist Wallace Stegner, who got the name the Dean of Western Writers, and he really took that mantle from Bernard DeVoto. Before Stegner was sort of the recognized guru of all things West, that person was really his mentor, Bernard DeVoto. So the inversion, the interesting twist that happened is that, while the DeVotos were in this crusade to stop dams from being built in national parks, to stop public lands from being sold off, and they came under attack from Senator McCarthy and his minions, Julia Child came into their lives, and Avis and Julia became best friends. And so today, Avis DeVoto is really the best known, the best remembered DeVoto. If you've seen the 2009 movie Julie and Julia with Meryl Streep, Deborah Rush plays Avis DeVoto. There was a best-selling book of selected letters between Avis DeVoto and Julia Child. I've seen a copy here at this library. There's a show on HBO Max right now called Julia. Bebe Neuwirth plays Avis DeVoto. So Avis DeVoto is pretty famous right now, which is, I can't speak for them, but I think it would have shocked both DeVotos in their lifetime if you would have told them, Bernard, you're going to be the forgotten one, and Avis, you are going to be the famous, remembered, celebrated one. So.
Reading DeVoto is a kind of acid-like experience because the language is so peculiar, and it's obviously that DeVoto influenced Cormac McCarthy, I think. What do you think? Yeah. Especially the book Red Meridian, where he writes about the Southwest. And the way he phrased things was so peculiar and so counterintuitive. For example, in Across the Wide Missouri, he said, the first step in the white man's subjugation of the Indian was to raise his standard of living. I thought, well, that's just not true. And then I started thinking about, well, where did the Native American tribes in the Southwest get horses? They got them from the Spaniards. They didn't steal them. Of course, they did steal some of them, but they obviously traded for the other horses. But once, especially the Plains Indians, got their hands on metal goods like kettles, knives, and then especially guns, their culture was basically ruined. Because the Neolithic life they were leading before that was now part of the Industrial Revolution. And I just think of DeVoto's writing is you just don't need to take drugs anymore. You just pick up one of his books. The other interesting thing about what you wrote about Pat McCarran, who was a senator from Nevada, who was a far bigger jerk than Joseph McCarthy, in my opinion, because he had so much power. Pat McCarran was portrayed in The Godfather 2 as Pat Geary. Yeah. If you remember, the most corrupt senator that ever existed, and just such a complete slime ball. And if you read about McCarran, this guy was a complete anti-Semitic. He was an absolute bald-faced racist. And this was the 1950s in America. And it has continued. It's like the Civil War has never ended. And what has not ended is the association between the far extreme right and the transfer of federal lands to state and ultimately private ownership. And I think it's interesting that things that happened a century ago or even 70, 80 years ago are really, the residue is still here. It's still continuing. In some way, it's more insidious.
If you were to take a couple of shoe boxes and throw them on the floor, and if you went through the list of historic sites that are in Montana, you would probably throw, if you had cards for each one, you'd probably throw 80% of them in the shoebox that are private residences. And you know what I'm talking about. Every town has the home that was built by the district judge or the famous and long-standing pharmacist or an attorney or maybe a long dead mayor. But he built this house and it's been through generations of ownership. And then pretty soon it gets old enough and the people who are in it think, well, dude, we could make this could make it on the list. The list is not hard to get onto. And it's almost astonishingly simple because A, it has to be 50 years old, and B, it has to have some cultural association with time and place. And if you read the criteria with the National Park Service, they're the ones that handle all the nominations and give out the awards. That's pretty much it. And you could find that for many, many homes in the towns that we all live in. My hometown of Havre had the Jestrab house, which he was a famous doctor, and it was this palatial manor up on the hill. We called it Pill Hill. And it was just a home, but it's a neat home. And my old Episcopal church in Havre, which is now not even open anymore, it's on a national register. So what this comes to is there can be a lot of really interesting places, banks and bridges and battlefields, like on the subtitle of my book, or they can just be some pretty generic places. So some of the places that I ran into included airway radar beacons that they used in the 30s that were up on, there's still a couple left, one out outside of Butte and one of them outside of Helen and McDonald Pass. They're still standing. They've been nominated. They're on the register. And biplanes carrying U.S. mail would use those as homing sites to get over the top of the Continental Divide. There's a creamery. There's a radio station. There's some irrigation canals. There's really utilitarian-looking places. My famous one is Froggy's stopping off place on the Whoop Up Trail. And no, I've never been there. I have no reason to go there. But somebody there realized that maybe that's pretty cool, and we'll just get it nominated.
But, you know, if something's on the National Register, it's not protected, right? Like the Mercantile here, there was that huge fight. People didn't want to tear it down. Other people want it torn down. And they compromised, and they produced a Frankenstein building with a tumor of the old building stuck inside the body of the bigger building.
Bill's right. Nothing is sacrosanct and nothing is forever, and this is a very fluid list. One thing I discovered is that you look at the list and it's intact, but you start digging a little further, and there was the Opime Railroad Depot in Opime, Montana, that got burned down in a freak Halloween wind-driven prairie fire. But it's still on the list. They just haven't quite gotten around to taking it off. So there's some oddities out there like that, but it is not it's not sacrosanct. Near Kalispell up in Whitefish, it was a Frank Lloyd Wright building, and that created quite a stir when that went down because people wanted it preserved and saved, and it had greater commercial value not there than being there. So nothing is forever.
I want to just go back to Holly Heron. In 1924, this guy named William Sutherland was basically living off the land. He hunted and he fished, and you could take like a gazillion fish every day and shoot as many ducks as you wanted. And so he decided, because America was a new place and wasn't beholden to the old English common law tradition that if it isn't yours, you can't hunt or fish on. He thought you could go anywhere. Well, Holly Heron discovered William Sutherland shooting ducks and fishing in his water. Those are his fish. Those are his ducks. And that air above his house is his air. And that was the whole heaven to hell doctrine. You own everything to outer space all the way to the middle of the earth, where it's met, I guess, by the property rights of someone in China. Now, I don't know how you would adjudicate that, but that's their problem. So anyway, Holly didn't run the guy off. What he did is he sued him, and he went to district court, and he only wanted $1 in compensation. But what he wanted to do is establish a precedent that the landowner owns everything. You have no right to trespass on my property to do anything whatsoever. Went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of Montana confirmed that, indeed, you own everything that is inside a non-navigable stream, and you own everything between a navigable stream, between the low water mark and the next low water mark. Well, in late 1970s, the Heron Rule, which it was called, was in force all those years. And a guy named Dennis Michael Curran, who had bought 70,000 acres surrounding the beautiful Dearborn River, which is a tributary of the Missouri. It's a gorgeous river. Not that big, and there was an argument in court, can anyone navigate on this thing? Well, yeah, in June when it's high, you can put a boat on it. Usually the rest of the time you're going to kind of come up short in terms of getting from one place to another. And so Dennis Curran had strung barbed wire across the Dearborn River in order to apparently decapitate floaters, I suppose. They were camping on his land. He said they were spreading garbage. And in retaliation, he drove over one of their rubber rafts and was charged with a misdemeanor. So that went to the Butte recreationists decided to sue Dennis Curran. And they won their case in district court. Of course, the Heron Rule went to the Supreme Court again. And as a consequence, the Supreme Court said, based on the new Montana Constitution, that if you can recreate on a stream, you can use it. It doesn't matter who the property owner is. And they also basically recognized a kind of turning on its head the low water mark to low water mark to make it high water mark to high water mark. So you can invade someone's property up to the high water mark. For example, where we live out on the river, people come by all the time, and they understand by and large that they can come up on our banks, but they can't come to the house and ask for a drink. Although that did happen once. Anyway, so, Heron himself is forgotten. He actually was never known. He was a failure at politics. All he had going for him was he was rich, and he controlled a lot of land. But when you look at case law, you'll see the Heron Rule all over the place, although it's now defunct.
It just sounds like this guy Heron was the type of person that would have hated Bernard DeVoto and vice versa back in the day. How'd it turn out with the girl?
My girl?
Yeah.
My wife?
No, the one that you did you marry her?
Oh, yeah, we got married.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, of course. Quite a long time ago, and her family had kind of a mixed reaction to this book. Her sisters had kind of I don't know, they were conflicted about it because the men in the Heron family were really just a bunch of creeps. And for example, her Uncle Gordon, who inherited the remnants of the Oxbow Ranch, which had then moved to the Helena Valley, was a president of the Lewis and Clark County Farm Bureau, which was part of the Farm Bureau Federation. They hated the United Nations because it was controlled by communists. They hated wheat subsidies because it was controlled by socialists. He hated anything that smacked of government interference in his right to basically run his ranch into the ground as he saw fit. They owned 1,000 acres in the Helena Valley. It was totally irrigated. They grew potatoes. They could grow anything. They grew so many crops, including sugar beets, that they paid for busloads of Mexican immigrants to come to Helena and weed the sugar beets before harvest. He was also a huge advocate of using Agent Orange and Roundup on every plant that was not producing money. And some of the people along the roads in Lewis and Clark County became unhappy because their fruit trees were dying. And he said, tough, I have stuff to grow, you don't. And so the family, I got a letter from her cousins, who are Gordon Heron's children, telling me that they deeply regretted buying my book. Sorry.
I'll read your book and I won't regret it. I promise. In the assembling of this book about historic sites, I worked with some good people at Mountain Press, and we decided in the early goings that we're only going to do so many. Out of the 1,000, we did 50. They're carefully selected, and we look for a geographic balance. You know, Eastern Montana kind of gets the short end of a lot of stuff, and it's really hard to kind of look for things out there that have some readership interest. So we divided also things into two parts. When you think about historic sites in Montana on the national list, there's what we call built landscapes, structures, bridges, banks, and then there are natural landscapes. Who's been down the Missouri River and went past Citadel Rock? It's there, and it's natural. It's not man-made, and it's on a national register. There's no plaque there. There's nothing attached to the face of this iconic rock that the steamboat navigators used to know where they were. And they would always say they would lay to, the steamboat captains, they would lay to, so you look up at this 100-foot tall volcanic igneous dike that sticks out of nowhere in the sandstone bluffs. That's a natural site. The Bear Paw Battlefield south of Chinook is a natural site, but the preponderance of these buildings and structures and built landscape things are fixed in place man-made objects, and I'll come to in a moment to one of the ones that was most interesting to us.
Where are we?
Oh. All right. Well, about Eastern Montana, one of the fun things when I was researching my book was in 1946, and this is a plug, by the way. I'm going to give a talk at 3 o'clock in the next room over. So if you want to hear the full story of this, please come to that. But in 1946, the Devotos were researching for a book that Bernard was going to write that would win the National Book Award. They were going to research Lewis and Clark. And they lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So they planned to take this trip of a lifetime, a trip that Bernard had been dreaming about for years and couldn't do because of World War II. So in 1946, with the war over, they're going to drive from Massachusetts to the Pacific Ocean, following the Lewis and Clark Trail, and they're going to take their 2 boys with them. And Bernard is thinking he's going to write a conservation column for Harper's Magazine, and he thinks it's going to be a positive column because through the 1930s he had been following the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and things they had been doing to restore damaged landscapes in the West. And so they head west, and they get to the Dakotas, and suddenly, like, the mood of the trip goes dark because they see the beginning of the Garrison Dam being built on the Missouri River, which is going to create a reservoir that's going to flood out around 150,000 acres of the homelands of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. And Devoto knows from his study of history that the biggest public lands frauds and scams have gone hand in hand with this type of Native American dispossession, which he thought was a thing of the 1800s. So he's outraged to see it still happening in the middle of the 1900s. And he knows that that type of dispossession of Native American lands goes hand in hand with public lands scams because the common denominator is natural resource grabs, natural resource raiding, bonanzas, boom time. So he begins to wonder if something else might be coming along, something that is being kept secret. And they get to Miles City, Montana. And Miles City, Montana was a place that had the first publicly managed grazing district in the whole United States, Mitzpah Pumpkin Creeks. It's a little piece of conservation history, but this shared grazing district, about 100,000 acres at the junction of Mitzpah and Pumpkin Creeks around Miles City, Montana, that would influence Franklin Roosevelt to sign an act called the Taylor Act, which eventually created what we now know of as the BLM. That all has its roots in Miles City, Montana. So the BLM was the seed that led to the birth, if that is an apt metaphor, that came in Miles City, Montana. So the DeVotos get there in 1946, and they go to the Range Riders Cafe because Bernard loves to eat, and Avis is fascinated with food, a fascination that will eventually lead her to Julia Child. And inside the Range Riders Cafe, where Bernard DeVoto knows one of the best steak dinners in America is served, and he will gleefully tell his readers on the Eastern Seaboard that for no amount of money in their time zone can they buy a steak dinner anywhere near as good as the one he can buy for $1.75 at the Range Riders Cafe in Miles City. Inside, he eavesdrops and here's a, quote, very loud, very drunk cattleman, unquote, boasting that there's going to be an attempt to destroy the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service. And that sends the DeVotos on this big odyssey as they're following the Lewis and Clark Trail to try to figure out the exact details of what's getting worked up. And so that's what their adventure turns into in 1946. So I don't know if the Range Riders Cafe is on the historic sites, but I would make a case that it should be.
You're welcome to nominate it.
Why not?
Okay. I mean, yeah.
It's not hard to get on.
This is kind of related to the whole public lands thing, but the Montana Public Service Commission is it's a description of Roger Koopman, who was term limited and is not any longer on the board, diseased and dysfunctional. And the 5 Republicans that now serve on the Public Service Commission do not get along. They've accused each other of stealing each other's emails. You have this guy, Randy Pinocci, who owned a printing business in eastern Montana, who said during one of the meetings that, remember, these people are regulating the utility industry in Montana, and it is a monopoly, and they like coal. And Randy, he likes coal a lot. He said, in fact, that he had been told that McDonald's soda fountains release more carbon dioxide than all the coal-fired plants in the United States. Now, I didn't have to look that up. I sensed that was not correct. But you know, thinking about the Public Service Commission has always been, as Koopman said, a bunch of surly men. And my wife's grandfather, George Francis Burke, who claimed to be a civil engineer, of course he wasn't, he didn't have a degree, but he managed to get jobs anyway. And he learned it in the field, which is maybe the best way to do it. In 1934, got appointed the chief engineer for the Railroad and Public Service Commission, which is what the PSC was called back then, which was created, I think, in 1907 to regulate the monopolies in Montana, which included the railroads, you know, the power company, which was Montana Power at the time, and, you know, everything else, water, natural gas, everything. They were responsible for mitigating the monopolistic greed that these corporations had. The Public Service Commission was then 3 people. Now it's 5 people. But the problems it had then were just as bad as they are now, probably worse, because you had 2 men, Thomas Carey and Jerry Connolly, who were New Deal Democrats. And then you had this right-wing Republican named Andrew Young, and they fought with each other all the time. And the Democrats had made enemies of the Montana Power Company, the Anaconda Company. So what they did is they had him arrested for molesting young boys. And they had a witness who later recanted, but so it gets to district court, and remember, this guy's the head of the Public Service Commission, accused of molesting boys. Okay, so the jury's out for 90 minutes and comes back with an innocent verdict because there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever. The next thing they did was accuse Jerry Conley of bugging Andrew Young's office by running a cord between two dictaphones so he could record Andrew's whatever Andrew was doing. The governor rushed down in the middle of the night, ordered all the offices in the Capitol in Helena be searched for bugs, and Jerry Conley escaped that as well. But these endemic problems in Montana, they're really quite old. And I think with the Public Service Commission, it's built into the legislation that created it. And these guys now on the Public Service Commission, like Jennifer Fielder, these are right-wing people who are allied with the Oath Keepers. They're allied with far-right extremists who are also in bed with people who would like to transfer land from the federal government to the states and therefore be at the mercy in Montana of a Republican majority. Many of these guys would like to just sell everything off. But the problems in Montana that we have are pretty well established by, I think, legislation.
Who here has been to Fort Benton? Who's seen the Hornaday Buffalo exhibit? Yeah, it's iconic, and William T. Hornaday, who stuffed those animals back in 1887, is responsible for those. And if you haven't been there, it's something you need to see. It's not your typical taxidermy mount where you have a wooden pedestal and a singular animal, kind of like in the New York City, Museum Natural History. All those animals are one animal on a wooden pedestal looking pretty dumb. But he assembled a family group of buffalo with a small calf and, the bull and a cow and the sagebrush and I think there's a rattlesnake in a very, very natural looking setting. Where did those buffalo come from? Southern Garfield County. You know what's in southern Garfield County? Nothing. Yeah, a lot of sagebrush and a lot of black cows. So the site where these animals were harvested in late fall 1887, when Hornaday came out west on a Northern Pacific train, detrained at Miles City, hired a cook from the nearby military post, hired a couple of cow hands, a couple of wranglers, and rented some freight wagons and took off north because it was known at that time, and his authorities and officials back in Smithsonian realized that we are going to lose all of these buffalo. And if we don't capture some right now, there'll be nothing left for us to look at. So his mission, and he did choose to accept it, was to go out in the land between the Yellowstone River and the Musselshell River and find what was known to be some of the last surviving bands of bison on the northern plains. They spent 5 weeks in a miserable encampment on a place called Little Porcupine Creek. The reason they went in the fall was because, for 2 reasons. Buffalo put on their best hides in preparation for winter in the late fall, early winter. Also, they wanted to go when they knew there would be some snow on the ground so that they could have that to benefit them for tracking these animal herds if they ever found them. Well, they did, and they also had a kind of a side gig going on because they were going to collect some other specimens and take them back to Washington, D.C. and stuff them too. They killed a truckload of animals. They killed deer, they killed porcupines, they killed rabbits. It was just kind of an orgy of hunting for these guys, but they did finally secure suitable specimens to put into freight wagons, take back to Miles City, take back to Washington, D.C., where this beautiful mounting platform was, and it stayed in Washington, D.C. until, I believe, 1955. And then it was shipped out to Montana and put into storage, the whole thing. Until in the 80s, it was restored, and the people in Fort Benton had a venue for it in their museum there. And I urge you to go and see that sometime, because it's historic and it's very natural and it's very real. So the backstory on it is, my wife and I decided to go find the Hornaday Buffalo campsite, which is, I'm sorry, it's on the National Register. Did I say it's easy to get on that register? So we looked up on Montana Cadastral, and we did the Google Earth, and based on the entries that Hornaday made into his diary, we were able to pinpoint kind of sort of where it was. And so we find the owner of this land in southern Garfield County. He's an old rancher. He lives in Roundup. And I said, do you know anything about this? Oh, yeah. Hey, can we go there? Can we get permission? Yeah, it's no problem. I'll give you the rights and lefts and here and there. And, well, of course, we immediately got lost once we set out in southern Garfield County to find the damn thing. And we eventually did, and we took some pictures of it. There's 2 pictures in the book. There's nothing there. There's a stock pond nearby on Little Porcupine Creek, but you won't find that wonderful anodized aluminum sign there.
Well, didn't Audubon shoot birds in order to?
Yeah.
Of course he did.
Yeah. And some of the other naturalists, one of the botanists Wallace, wanted to get specimens of the fruit the trees were bearing, but he didn't want to climb the tree, so he just shot the branches out. Oh, is this not?
This site is, to me, it's a place where preservation caught up with extinction. It's more of a concept than an actual site.
Oh, there we go. No? Okay, I'll just talk about it. I have one more thing. You know, Montanans are extremely upset about wealthy ranchers from other states, wealthy industrials coming in and buying big swatches of land. But again, this is an old tradition in Montana, and the most iconic of these hobby ranches, I think, was Polly Heron's ranch, which was bought by a Ohio industrialist in 1934 named Irvin Reekie. And Irvin had grown up in the Missouri Breaks, and his father had made a fortune, inventing stuff and manufacturing oil drums, I think is what the wealth came from. And in 1935, he bought the Oxbow Ranch, and it's 30 square miles, or how many acres it was, from the bank that had foreclosed on Polly. The family lore said that the banker was caught in bed with Polly's wife, and somehow there was a trade-off there. I don't know. Again, the sisters don't want to talk about it. A plea deal of some sort. Anyway, Irvin wanted to turn the Oxbow Ranch basically into a game preserve, and he had plans for camels. He had a little herd of bighorn sheep. The house he built, every room was a panel with different hardwood. He owned a yacht named the Homa, which was sailed up the St. Lawrence River to Detroit and then across the lakes, and then put on a train, transferred to moving dollies, I believe in Craig, Montana. When they got to whatever that bridge is, it wouldn't fit under the trestle. And so they stood there for a couple of days trying to figure out, how are we going to get this thing to Halter Lake? Finally, some kid said, why don't you deflate the tires? And so they did. I mean, that's a common tactic for moving things. And they put the Holman into Halter Lake, and it was there for, I think it was 20 years. Finally, he sold it to an Hawaiian industrialist, and on the way to the marina, to have it transferred to the moving dollies again, it ran out of gas and floated around Holter Lake for some time while the crew abandoned ship and swam to shore.
This is just a talking stick. Check. Sibilant, check. Sorry.
There it is.
Well, anyway. Oh, hey. I don't know. We were talking. You know that when William T. Hornaday was in Washington D.C. stuffing those buffalo in 1887, Teddy Roosevelt came up to him and introduced himself to him because Roosevelt in 1883 came west to hunt buffalo. He wanted to shoot a buffalo before they were gone, and when he got west in 1883, he crossed the border from Dakota Territory into Montana Territory, and he got one of these last buffalo, but that was a revelation for him because all around he just saw bones and skulls and rotting corpses, and that was what transformed Roosevelt into a conservationist. Was that spot should be on the historical markers. And I'll tell the Eastern Montana story, and then I'll bring it to Missoula. But when I was working on my book, because I've got this scene in the Range Riders Cafe in Miles City, I wanted to be able to describe the Range Riders Cafe, and there's a guy on Facebook who posts a lot of historic photos of Miles City, so I reached out to him, and I was like, I'm trying to learn what the Range Riders Cafe looked like, and he's like, well, I don't have any photos of it, but I know there's an old cowboy in town, a good horseman, and he's an elderly guy. His dad grew up in Miles City. You should call him. And remember, DeVoto, all he wrote was that he was in the Range Riders Cafe and he heard a, quote, very loud, very drunk cattleman. He overheard this guy, and that's how he got his big tip. So anyway, I talked to this old horseman guy, elder guy in Miles City, and we're having a good conversation, and I was asking him to tell me about the Range Riders. He said, oh, yeah, my dad used to take me in there. He gave me a description of the place, told me about the upstairs and the downstairs, the mirrors, what the waiters wore, where the bottles were on the wall, like great details. And he, is asking me, now, why are you asking this? What are you working on? And I was like, well, I'm working on this book about this guy named Bernard DeVoto. Says he came to the Range Riders Cafe in 1946, and he learned about a big public lands plot by eavesdropping on a very loud, very drunk cattleman. And I just shut up because I wasn't going to say it. But he was thinking the exact same thing because he said it. He went, that might have been my dad. But to bring it back to historical places in Missoula, one of the other cool things about researching my book was the DeVoto's favorite hotel in America was the Florence. And in 1946, Bernard DeVoto brags in Harper's Magazine saying it's the best hotel in America. He says, the Florence is just as modern as tomorrow, written in 1947. And Avis DeVoto used to like to go across the street to the Missoula Mercantile, and she would buy spices, paprika and dill, and she would mail them to Julia Child in France. So
That's great.
yeah.
Not far from Miles City, up in Sydney, across the Yellowstone River, is this famous bridge, which is not on the National Register. I don't know what's with the people in Richland County, but the Snowden Bridge needs to be there. The last entry I have in my book is a picture, just a gorgeous two-piece of photography is showing this bridge. It's one of the last vertical lift bridges in North America. There's these gigantic concrete pillars that slowly would drop down and lift up the center piece of the Snowden Bridge to allow barges and steamboats. There weren't any more steamboats on the Yellowstone. The only thing that ever really went up underneath that bridge when it was raised were barges to go up to Fort Peck Dam during its construction. But I put those two in there just to remind readers that there are just some terrific places out there that communities probably should just get together, do the homework, do the research. The Historical Society, there's a fellow named John Boughton there, and he's just the guru, and I've talked to him a lot, and he said, well, Michael, if if somebody wants to do something, they can do this, and we kind of get it ready and get it blessed and sanctified and squeaky clean, and then we send it on off to Washington, and they do their paperwork, and it's a done deal. Snowden Bridge someday will be on the National Register.
Are we done? Okay, questions?
How do you get something removed?
How do you work with the federal bureaucracy to take something off the dang list? I don't know the process, and I'm sure that some have been removed, but it's a huge spreadsheet, and I still see things like the Frank Lloyd Wright Light Building, which is not there anymore. The Opheim Depot is still on the list, but I'm sure there's a process, and I couldn't tell you what the answer is for taking things off.
Why would you want it removed?
We have a home on Keith Avenue that has a big plaque. And it is to honor a car dealer here who built a house.
And you don't want the plaque there.
I'm sorry, I don't think it's a...
Well, I think on private residences, there's a little bit of bragging rights to go with it, and you can get some grants for historic preservation. You can get some low interest loans through the state, but mostly it's just something to look cool on your front yard and give it a little more curb appeal and maybe enhance its resale value someday.
Did you say a car dealer or a car dealer? Car dealer. Well, there you go. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks for coming. That was fun.